Good morning, everyone. I'm Eugene. I'm one of the pastors here, and as always, I am glad that we get to worship together today, and today along with our friends, Mufasa and Scar. Thank you. We are in the middle of a short series on the biblical character of Daniel called Dare to be a Daniel, which is an improvement upon our first try at a sermon series title, I Double Dog Dare You to Be a Daniel. I know. Dare to be a Daniel. It sounds so bold and inspiring. It's appealing because we want to stand out. We want to do great things for God. We want to step up and be heroic in a time of crisis. But more often than not, we may find ourselves falling short or not really knowing how. We may even find our lives kind of boring or simply a struggle to survive. Or we might find that despite discovering the life-changing love of Jesus, our lives do not look all that different from those around us. So throughout this series, we've been looking at what made Daniel so special. And despite being in a foreign and hostile culture, how was God able to use him in such powerful ways? How did he resist all of the pressures and temptations that surrounded him? And moreover, how can we become like a Daniel? How can we be different to make a difference? And so today we're looking at chapter 6, the story of Daniel in the lion's den, which is everyone's favorite Sunday school classic. I wish I had a flannelgram kind of thing here with me, but just look at him. He looks like he is having the time of his life. Who wouldn't want to spend the night cuddling a bunch of friendly lions? And the story is often used to say something along the lines of this: if you trust in God, if you do the right thing, God will protect you. Or if you just pass God's test, he will bless you with success. And that sounds great, but that doesn't quite tell the whole story. Doing right is, as we often say, no guarantee that everything will go right. The reality is God sometimes delivers us from pain and hardship, but also sometimes he delivers us through our pain and hardship. And of course, one day, God will surely deliver us and make all things right. But in this world, in this life, Jesus himself promised us that we will have trouble. As Pastor Dave likes to say, if you squeeze a lemon, you get lemon juice. If you squeeze an orange, you get orange juice. If you squeeze a Christian, you never know what you're going to get. But whatever it is, that's the stuff that they're really made of. It's the tests and trials of life that reveal who we really are. They reveal what we trust in, what we have built our lives upon. And so when, not if, when trouble or trial or temptation comes our way, the question is, how will we respond? Daniel faced the test of his integrity that brought him face to face with some literal lions. But all of us encounter various lions throughout our lives. A lion might come in the form of temptation to compromise your integrity, or to spin or fudge the truth to make yourself look better at work or in class. Or a lion might come in the form of an argument when you're tempted to lash out in anger, or when you've been home with your kids all day and you're tempted to lose your temper with them. Or it could be when someone wrongs you, or when something in your life goes wrong. and you feel like you're at the end of your rope. Or it can come when you are stressed and tired, and so you surf the internet in search of escape in ways that you know are not healthy or holy. There are these moments, both big and small, that reveal our character, especially when no one is looking. And so today we want to talk about how do we grow into someone as steadfast and faithful as Daniel. And the answer might not be as complicated or out of reach as we think. And so today we're going to revisit this well-known Bible story. And we're going to go through it. But in order to really enter into it, I want us to consider what Daniel has already been through. By the time we meet him in chapter 6, he is no longer such a young man. He's already seen his own people conquered and taken captive by a foreign army, these Babylonians. He himself gets hand-chosen and groomed into leadership by this powerful empire and rising to third in command over an entire kingdom. He's seen God use his insight and his wisdom to shape nations. He's literally seen the rise and fall of kings. Basically, by this point in the story, Daniel has done it all. He has seen that, he has done that, he's been there. You get the idea. And now, Babylon has been taken over by the Median Empire, and Daniel finds himself serving under a new king by the name of Darius. And so this is where we find Daniel in this story in Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. This new king Darius appoints governors, these 120 satraps, who are basically these officials who ruled over the land. And these 120 satraps had 3 administrators who were in charge over all of them. And Daniel, due to his proven track record, his wisdom, his exceptional giftedness, was one of these 3. But the Bible also tells us Daniel so distinguished himself among the rest by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the entire kingdom, which of course made all of the other officials jealous. And so what did? They plotted against him. And they tried to find any grounds to bring charges against him. And you can imagine that they would have watched and scrutinized his every move. But such was Daniel's integrity and character that they couldn't find no corruption in him whatsoever, because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. See, they realized that Daniel had only one weakness. The only way they could trap Daniel was unless it had something to do with the law of his God. And you thought your office politics was bad, right? I want you to think about this. After years spent in the highest levels of politics and power, Daniel was so clean that the only dirt they could find on him is that he was too pure and too devoted to his God. And so these officials devised this plan to appeal to King Darius's ego and trick him into issuing a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except for him, shall be thrown into the lion's den. And they made sure to get it in writing so that according to their laws, it could not be repealed. Just think about what their opinion of him must have been like. If they knew that the only way to trap Daniel was due to his unflinching integrity and character. See, all Daniel had to do is not pray to his God, and he'd be fine. And so what does Daniel do? He freaks out because all these people don't like him and are out to get him. No, that's not what he does. He responds in the most chill way ever. When Daniel learned about this decree, what did he do? He went home. He went to his upstairs room, opened his windows toward Jerusalem, and this is what he did every day, 3 times a day. He got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to God. And here's the important part, just as he had done before. Same routine, no change, just as he had done before. He simply kept his regular routine. Oh, everyone is conspiring against me and praying will literally put my life in danger. Well, I guess I'll just open these windows and pray where everyone can see me. I want to point out here that Daniel wasn't trying to convert anyone or force his religion onto anyone. He wasn't trying to start some culture war. He was simply standing firm, living out his faith in ways that others couldn't help but notice. This was persecution, and it was personal. These officials wanted Daniel out. They wanted him dead. What would you do? What would you do in a situation like this? I suppose some of us might be tempted to simply close the window, right? I mean, would it make that much of a difference? And perhaps that might have been the more sensible thing to do, but in this situation, Daniel, being who he is, decides there's really nothing to fear. Remember, he has seen kings and kingdoms rise and fall. He is not going to be intimidated by a few bullies. He has seen God's power and faithfulness demonstrated to him in good times and bad. What are some lions to him? And so, predictably, these officials all went as a group to find Daniel right where they knew he'd be. Same time, same place, every day, 3 times a day, praying to his God. And then, of course, they told on him. They went to the king and said, "Did you not publish a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you would be thrown into the lion's den?" And the king answered, yes, of course, I remember that. That decree that cannot be repealed. And then they went in for the kill, literally, right? Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. And the king, being a big fan of Daniel, when he heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to try to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. But his officials insisted. They said, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." And so the king gave the order. And they brought Daniel and they threw him into the lion's den. And the king says to Daniel, just as he's being thrown in, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Most of us know how the story goes. After a sleepless night, King Darius got up at first light and he hurries to the lion's den and he calls out, "Daniel," notice what he calls him, "servant of the living God, has your God," again, "whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" To which Daniel answers, "May the king live forever. My God has sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." This particular story has a pretty happy ending. Daniel was saved, the king dealt with his enemies, and even ended up issuing a new decree that the whole kingdom must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. Awesome. story is that in the face of opposition and danger, Daniel stood firm. Daniel did not even flinch. And so we return to the question, our original question, how? How does he do it? You know, over the past year, it has been reported that churches in China have seen increased levels of persecution by the government there. Their buildings have been demolished. Even a children's Bible study class was raided by dozens of police who declared it an illegal gathering, and they took down names and addresses and confiscated their phones. It's hard for us to imagine here in the United States how terrifying that must be. And they have ransacked homes and have had Christians followed and placed under arrest. And just this past December, police raided this one church and arrested a pastor and his wife, along with at least 100 church members, simply because they're worshiping Jesus. And so with their pastor and their fellow brothers and sisters arrested, with the doors of their church closed, with them being closely watched and monitored, you know what these Christians did the following Sunday? Well, they just continued to worship just as they had done before, only outdoors. These are Daniel Christians. And we might wonder if we would ever have that kind of courage in the face of persecution. You know, the most persecution that many of us experience for our faith is when the waiter at a restaurant interrupts us while we're trying to pray before a meal, right? Always makes me nervous, you know? Some of us might wonder whether our lives can have this kind of purpose, this kind of conviction. Daniel seems so extraordinary when I just seem so ordinary. Where did Daniel get such guts? How did he become so courageous and bold, so rock solid? The secret, I believe, is actually quite simple. It didn't happen overnight. See, the story here isn't so much about Daniel's heroic courage in a moment of testing. It's about his simple, steadfast faithfulness that prepared him for the test. The passage itself seems to emphasize this repeatedly. In Daniel 6:10, when faced with opposition, he simply did what he did every day. He got down on his knees and he prayed just as he had done before, 3 times a day. You see, the secret to Daniel's courage was his consistency. The secret to his big faith was his small, everyday faithfulness. So that when the time came, when he was faced with a big challenge, it didn't even feel that big to him. He's like, they're just lions. In other words, we can't do big things for God unless we are also willing to do the small, everyday things of holiness and love and serving others. We won't be ready for a big test unless we take lots and lots of smaller practice tests. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but growing up, my Korean immigrant parents placed a lot of emphasis on education. And so I spent many a weekday afternoon and Saturday mornings as well going to these standardized test prep schools. You know, this was my childhood. Learning and drilling test-taking skills over and over and over again. You know, I had number 2 pencil lead in my blood, you know. And by the time it was actually time to take the SAT many years later, I didn't even bother studying for it. Not because I'm brilliant, but because I just had a ton of practice. I had been preparing for years. I was ready. Similarly, we can't do this one crazy, intense workout and expect to suddenly just run a marathon. We need to train. And when I go to my doctor for my annual physical exam, no matter what I might say to him or how much I wished differently, I think it's pretty obvious to him that I am not exactly an Olympic athlete. These hips don't lie. Right? It would be awesome, right? Just to work out super hard for one whole day and get in shape. But we all know it doesn't work that way. Being fit and healthy requires day after day, week after week, month after month of getting exercise and eating right. In the same way, being spiritually healthy is not about making this huge, one big sacrifice, but making many small ones along the way. There are no shortcuts to a deep spiritual life. It takes time and patience and perseverance. It's what Eugene Peterson has called a long obedience in the same direction. One step in front of the other. One day after the other. 1 year after the other. We can't expect to have a rock-solid faith like Daniel without doing the slow, tedious work of spiritual training so that when hardship and testing comes, we might have that spiritual muscle memory to ground ourselves in the depths of God's love and faithfulness instead of succumbing to fear. And so as we look at Daniel, as we look at him as this example, I want to point out 3 things for us that make him such a great example for us that we can follow and emulate. And the first one is this. Daniel never forgot that he was in exile. In other words, he never forgot that Babylon was not his home. Even though he lived among a foreign people that worshiped other gods, Daniel never forgot who he was and whom he served. And most importantly, he didn't keep it a secret. King Darius said, "May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you." He says it again, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to rescue from the lions?" See, Darius recognized that Daniel was first and foremost God's servant. Even his enemies called him one of those exiles from Judah. In other words, they're saying, he's not one of us. He was in exile. He was different. He served the living God. It was obvious to everyone. For us, we also need the reminder that we are not supposed to blend in. We too are exiles. This world is not our home. We don't live according to its rules or its values. And Daniel was not afraid to stand out and be different, even if it meant coming under fire from others. We too are called to be different, to live differently. And so the question is, can people identify you as different? Or maybe even that bar is too low. Can people identify you as a follower of Jesus? Is that the most important thing that people know about you? As I mentioned before, today in China and many other parts of the world, people are regularly persecuted and even killed because they follow Jesus. According to one study, an average of 160,000 Christians worldwide are martyred every year. And so if someone were looking for a few Christians to kill today, would they think of you? Have you lived your life in such a way that people around you would say, let's see, you're looking to beat up a Christian? You should go see. Would anyone think of you? What do you say and do? How do you live in a way that sets you apart from everyone else? For some of us, it might mean that we need to think through how we can be more consistent between our public and private lives. For some of us, we have been sort of undercover Christians, so to speak. And I'm not suggesting that we, get face tattoos of Jesus or anything like that. We're called to be thoughtful about how to engage, how to be who we are openly so that we can share the love of God with others. This may seem like a trivial example, but, back to the whole waiter interrupting you during prayer, I'm always conscious of praying whenever I'm sharing a meal with others, especially people who I know are not Christians. And so I'll be honest, there are times when I don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, and so even I just do that quick stealth prayer, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, I'm done, But in those times, I realize it's mostly me who's uncomfortable. And so I'm offering this as a simple invitation to myself as well as for all of us. Next time you are eating with a client or a colleague or a friend who's just not really into the whole church and Jesus thing, it's totally fine. Perhaps you can simply, I'm going to role play for you, okay? Simply say something like this. I hope you don't mind. I usually just have a moment of thanks before I eat. Would that be okay? Okay. Thanks so much. Would that be okay? Maybe you might do it differently. I think that most people will appreciate sincerity, will appreciate honesty and integrity. Perhaps it might even spark some conversation. And so the first thing to consider is that Daniel never forgot who he was, whose he was. Daniel never forgot that he was a stranger in a foreign land, that he's supposed to be different. He's supposed to be recognizable. And may it be that way for us as well. How might we stand out? How might we be identified as followers of Jesus? The second thing is that although Daniel knew he was in exile, although he knew he wasn't home, he served God where he was. He served God where God placed him, which was at the time in Babylon, in Persia. And he did so by maintaining who he was, by maintaining holding on to his integrity no matter the cost, and living in such a way that even his enemies could find no fault in him. If somebody were to scrutinize your life, turned over every stone, looked at your past, your browsing history, your purchases, how you spent your time, and what would they find? Daniel tells King Darius, has a confidence to tell King Darius, I have never done any wrong before you. And as a result, Daniel was able to not just be different, but to make a difference, right? He was in the very center of power, and yet he answered to a higher power. He was this total, ultimate insider, but never lost sight of who he was on the inside. What would it look like for you to serve God where you are? In your work, or your school, or home, or in your relationships, or in your ministry? How would you do what you do differently? Because it is God whom you serve, not man or yourself. Think about what you do. How would you do that differently, knowing that you are serving God continually? Right? What would it look like for you to do that, not just for a day, not just for a week, but faithfully over the long haul? Maybe you won't notice much difference in one day or even a month or perhaps even a year, but through your steadfast faithfulness, isn't it possible that you might win the trust of others? Isn't it possible that you might make people curious about what makes you different? And so, serve God where you are. Third, and perhaps this is most important, Daniel practiced his faith. And by that I mean he literally practiced. He had habits that kept him connected to God. Even though he was in a foreign land and surrounded by different cultures, he lived a life patterned in prayer. He prayed 3 times a day, as if it was as essential as eating. And most suggest that he prayed in the morning, noon, and night. I guess that makes sense, right? Morning, noon, night. Morning, noon, night. Morning, noon, night. Every day, morning, noon, night. And it might seem kind of boring, kind of repetitive. But I believe it's this practice that enabled him to pass the test. It enabled him to stand firm in the face of all of the change and challenges that he faced. Asher Ginsburg, a Hebrew writer and philosopher, wrote this: "More than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews." In other words, what he means by that is this: the practice of keeping the Sabbath is what has preserved the life and identity of the Jewish people, much more than their own devotion and effort. The Sabbath is what sets them apart, what makes them different. It reminds them who they are and whom they serve and worship. And in the same way, we also need practices that keep us, that set us apart from the rest of the world. And for Daniel, it was his daily rhythm of prayer and giving thanks to God. Because whether we realize it or not, our habits and our practices form and shape us. And so I want to ask us to pause and consider, what are your habits? What are your practices? What is the first thing you do in the morning? What is the last thing you do at night? What do you do on your commute to and from work or school? Maybe your habit is checking social media every free moment you have. Or maybe you come home after work and binge watch Netflix. But have you ever considered how that is forming you? How that is shaping you? Nowadays, the word ritual kind of has this negative connotation, right? But a ritual is simply something that we do repeatedly for a purpose, for a reason. And so every night, my daughter and I have a nightly ritual. I bring her to her bed, I kiss her on the cheek, and she kisses me on the cheek. I kiss her on the other cheek, then she kisses me on the other cheek, and then, the forehead, the nose, you get the idea, And then we do our secret handshake, which I obviously can't show you because it's a secret, right? but it's awesome, you know. And like, it seems like each month or so, we add one more element, and it just keeps growing and growing. By the time she's like 18, it's going to be like an hour long, right? When we do this every night, almost without fail. Why? It's a ritual. It connects us. It's a ritual that means, good night, beloved. I love you. I honestly hope we never stop. Likewise, the purpose of spiritual practices and disciplines is not to be just one more rule that we have to add onto our list and keep legalistically. It's ritual and repetition that connects us to God and keeps us for God. Some days we might feel it, some days we might not, but we keep the ritual so the ritual can keep us. For some of us, it might be our morning devotion or time spent in silence or prayer, or taking a weekly walk in the woods, or reading scripture, or journaling. Maybe we might even try to pray like Daniel, right? Some people like to set an alarm at a set time every morning, noon, and night to remind them to pause, give thanks, and pray. I wonder how your life might be different if you were to try a practice like that for an entire month. Seriously, consider it. In our next sermon series, I want to tell you, we're going to be exploring some of the various traditions of the Christian faith, and each of these traditions have different practices or ways that people have connected with God over the centuries and throughout the world. And so hopefully we'll all get to experience God in both old and new ways in this coming season. And so, stay tuned for that. But one practice we might not think of as a ritual is simply going to church. Okay, so good job, everybody. Growing up, going to church was never an optional thing for me. It didn't matter where we were, what was going on, we always went to church. And of course, as a kid, I didn't always appreciate that, but it's something that set me apart from all my other friends at school. It reminded us of our identity as a family. We went to church. That's what we do. It's who we are. And one thing for sure, it definitely formed and shaped me. And nowadays, I get it, right? That many of us are busier than ever. But may I commend to you this practice, this ritual. Perhaps worshiping God with his people on Sundays needs to be more of a spiritual practice and discipline and less of one good option as long as we don't have anything else going on for the day. It's saying God isn't just an accessory to my life. Giving God our Sundays in worship, fellowship, and service is a way of keeping God in us and keeping us in God. There are many ways that we can connect with God and be kept in his presence. This is why we come together in worship together when we do all these liturgies and we do prayers and we sing songs and we take communion and we confess and we do all these things. You know why? It's practice. It's practice for when we go out there in the world. When faced with difficult and challenging situations, I find that it is not my incredible insight or knowledge that help me most when it matters. It's whatever I've practiced that rises to the forefront, that rises to the surface. So when I feel someone accusing or blaming me for something, I don't have to power up and defend myself because I've practiced confession. I've practiced holding on to the reality of my imperfection and my faults before God and before others without fear or shame. That's why we do confession every week. When I feel pressure to perform or impress others, I don't have to fear the opinions of others because I've practiced resting on the promises of God, resting my identity in His unfailing love for me. When things don't go my way or they seem out of control, I need not fear because I've practiced. I've worshiped a God who is good, who is bigger than any storm. So to review, to become a Daniel, first, we need to remember who we are. We need to remember we are different, that we are exiles. And we need to not keep that a secret. And second, even though this is not our home, we need to continually and faithfully serve God wherever we are, in whatever way God has called you on this earth. And third, we need to practice the slow and repetitive work of connecting to God every day. And we may not feel any different from day to day, but over time, He who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it. Over time, we will find that God is working in us. He is transforming us. And one day when a lion or a trial or a temptation or even persecution comes our way, we might find that we have more spiritual depth and power and strength and courage than we realized. Let's take a moment to just reflect a little bit. I want to invite us to bow our heads and close our eyes. And I want us to consider this question: what habit or practice can you do now that over time will form in you the kind of faith and character that Daniel had? What habit or practice might God be inviting you to commit to doing now, this week, or this month, that He might have the opportunity to do a work in you, a work of deepening, of growth, of transformation? And as you reflect on your life, I also want to invite you to consider this question: what habit or practice that you do now is getting in the way? What habit or practice is getting in the way of God having full access to you? As we sit with these two questions, let's invite the Holy Spirit to speak to us, to convict us, to move us into action this week. In a few moments, Pastor Walt will come and lead us in confession and Holy Communion. And after that, we're going to sing some songs, and then we're going to have a scripture. And the same thing we do every week is what we're going to do this week, because it's practice.